A Map of Thought, Episode 30, James Buchanan. Most of economics used to quietly assume that once someone becomes a politician, they magically transform into a selfless servant of the public good. James Buchanan built an entire Nobel-winning career on a single, almost embarrassingly obvious objection to that assumption. Why would they?
Lay out that objection properly, because stated that bluntly, it sounds almost too simple to be a real academic breakthrough.
It sounds simple because, once you hear it, it is genuinely hard to argue with. And that is exactly why it landed so hard when Buchanan and his colleagues started making the case seriously in the 1960s. Mainstream economics, up to that point, had spent decades building increasingly sophisticated models of how self-interested individuals behave in markets, consumers, workers, business owners, each pursuing their own advantage. But when those same economists turned to analyzing government, the model quietly flipped. Politicians were treated as benevolent planners, calmly calculating the greatest good for society. Bureaucrats were treated as neutral administrators, faithfully executing whatever policy would best serve the public. Buchanan, working alongside economist Gordon Tullock, asked why on earth we should assume human nature simply changes the moment someone walks into a government building. His answer became the foundation of an entire field called public choice theory. Treat politicians and bureaucrats exactly the way you would treat anyone else in an economic model, as people pursuing their own self-interest, career advancement, re-election, budget growth, prestige, and watch what that assumption actually predicts about how government behaves.
What does it predict, concretely?
A great deal that suddenly makes a lot of frustrating government behavior make perfect sense. It predicts that politicians will often favor policies that produce visible short-term benefits before the next election, even when a different policy would produce better long-term outcomes, because their personal career incentive runs on an election cycle, not a multi-decade horizon. It predicts that government agencies will tend to grow their own budgets and staff over time, regardless of whether their actual mission requires it, because bigger budgets and larger staffs generally mean more institutional prestige and career advancement for the people running them. And it predicts something Buchanan and Tullock gave a specific name to: rent-seeking, where individuals and companies spend enormous time and money not on actually producing anything valuable, but purely on lobbying government for special favors, protective regulations, or subsidies that transfer wealth toward themselves without creating any real new value for society at all.
Give us a real historical example of rent-seeking in action, since the term itself can sound abstract.
Before the example, it is worth pausing on just how uncomfortable this idea was for a lot of people when Buchanan first pushed it, because that discomfort is part of the story. Suggesting that elected officials and civil servants act largely out of self-interest, the same way anyone in a market does, struck plenty of people across the political spectrum as needlessly cynical, even insulting to public servants doing genuinely difficult work. Buchanan's response was that treating this as an insult rather than a testable claim was exactly the problem. If the assumption turned out to be false, the data would show government behaving very differently from how self-interested market actors behave. Instead, decade after decade of public choice research kept finding the opposite, and that empirical track record is a large part of why the field eventually won Buchanan a Nobel Prize in 1986, despite the initial hostility. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created in the United States in the late 19th century, is a classic case economists still study closely. It was originally established to regulate railroad rates and protect farmers and shippers from being exploited by powerful railroad monopolies. Over the following decades, something predictable happened, something economists later termed regulatory capture. The very industry the commission was supposed to be regulating gradually gained enormous influence over the commission itself, since railroad companies had far more resources, expertise, and sustained motivation to influence the regulator than the diffuse public ever did. By the mid-20th century, critics on both the political left and right had come to argue the commission was functioning less as a check on railroad power, and more as a tool railroads themselves used to limit new competition and protect their existing market position. Precisely the kind of rent-seeking capture Buchanan's framework predicts will tend to happen whenever concentrated interests face a diffuse, less organized public.
Let us bring this down to something genuinely everyday, because committees and budgets can feel distant from daily life.
Think about any committee inside a company, a school, a nonprofit that gets asked to review and cut its own budget. Notice how rarely that actually produces a serious cut. It is not because the people on the committee are bad or dishonest. It is because each individual member has a genuine personal stake in protecting the specific programs, staff positions, or resources closest to their own role and their own relationships. Ask the marketing team to find cuts and watch how much less enthusiastically they identify savings inside their own department compared to how quickly they spot waste in a completely different department. Buchanan's whole insight was that this is not a character flaw unique to lazy or corrupt people. It is the predictable, structural outcome of asking self-interested individuals to police their own resources, which is exactly why he argued so strongly for building rules and constraints in advance, before anyone knows exactly which specific interest they will personally hold.
That leads into his other major idea, constitutional economics. Explain that piece.
This is genuinely Buchanan's most original contribution, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. His argument was that the right time to design the actual rules of a political and economic system is before anyone knows what specific position they will personally occupy within it, a kind of veil of uncertainty about your own future interests. Design election rules, spending rules, and constitutional limits on government power while imagining you might end up as a wealthy business owner, a struggling laborer, a minority group member, or a powerful official, and you will tend to design fairer, more constrained rules than if each group simply negotiates rules after they already know exactly which side of every question they personally sit on. This is why Buchanan cared so much about constitutional limits on government power specifically, spending caps, balanced budget rules, strict limits on what a simple majority can vote to take from a minority, because he believed self-interest, once it knows its own position, will always try to bend the rules in its own favor, and the only real defense is designing durable constraints in advance, before that self-interest fully knows where it stands.
Is there a fair criticism of this whole framework worth naming before we get to where it shows up today?
There genuinely is, and it deserves real weight rather than a quick dismissal. Critics on the left have argued public choice theory, taken too far, can become a blanket argument against almost any government action at all, treating every regulation or public program as inherently corrupt or self-serving, when plenty of government interventions genuinely do produce broad public benefit that private markets alone would not deliver. Critics also point out that Buchanan's own framework, applied consistently, should make us equally suspicious of concentrated private economic power, not just government power, since a dominant private monopoly can pursue its own narrow self-interest at public expense just as effectively as a captured regulator can. Buchanan's fair response was that he was never arguing government action is always wrong, only that it should never be analyzed as though the people running it were somehow immune to the same self-interested incentives economists readily assume everywhere else. That is a genuinely different, more modest claim than blanket anti-government hostility, even though the theory has sometimes been used, by people well beyond Buchanan himself, to argue for exactly that blanket position.
Where does this land in ongoing debates happening right now?
Everywhere lobbying and campaign finance get discussed. Every argument about whether concentrated industries have too much influence over the regulations meant to govern them is essentially a live public choice argument, whether the people making it know Buchanan's name or not. And look at occupational licensing, the requirement that people obtain government permission, often after expensive training, simply to legally work in professions ranging from hair braiding to interior design in some jurisdictions. Economists studying this today consistently find that existing practitioners, not consumers, are frequently the ones pushing hardest for these licensing requirements, because tighter entry restrictions conveniently reduce competition for the people already established in the profession. That is textbook rent-seeking, operating in plain sight, in an industry you would never think to associate with the word. There is also a very live, very current debate about government efficiency initiatives, attempts by various governments in recent years to identify and cut wasteful spending and bureaucratic bloat. Buchanan's framework predicts exactly why these efforts are so difficult to actually execute, since every single program targeted for cuts has a real, organized constituency benefiting from it, while the broader public paying for the waste is diffuse and far less organized in its opposition. Whether any specific effort succeeds or gets quietly watered down by exactly the entrenched interests it targets is, itself, a living test of Buchanan's whole theory playing out in real time. Next time, we turn from who controls government spending to something even larger, who controls wealth itself, and why. Thomas Piketty spent years compiling centuries of tax records across multiple countries to answer a question that sounds simple and turns out to be genuinely explosive. Does wealth, left alone, naturally concentrate into fewer and fewer hands over time?
See you then.